In the final decades of the Byzantine Empire, a philosopher in a small city in southern Greece sat down and wrote a book proposing that the solution to everything was to bring back Zeus. He wanted temples, hymns, daily prayers to the Olympian gods, and a complete restructuring of society along the lines Plato had laid out nearly 2,000 years earlier. His name was Georgios Gemistos, though he'd later rename himself Plethon in a deliberate echo of Plato. And the most remarkable thing about his story isn't that he tried it, it's how close he came to being taken seriously. Plethon was born around 1360, give or take a few years, into a world that was falling apart in slow motion. The Byzantine Empire, which had once controlled everything from southern Spain to the borders of Persia, had been reduced to a handful of territories clinging to the edges of a Turkish tide. Constantinople was still the capital, still technically the seat of a Roman emperor, but the real power had long since shifted to the Turkish sultans, who controlled nearly everything around it. Sometime before 1410, Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos sent Plethon to Mistra, a fortified city in the Peloponnese that served as the capital of the Despotate of Morea. It was one of the last functioning pieces of the empire's once vast territory, a fortified hilltop city overlooking the Laconian plain, and it had become something of a haven for intellectuals. Plethon settled there and spent the rest of his life teaching philosophy, astronomy, history, and geography. He became a legal advisor to the ruling despots and a political counselor with real access to the Byzantine court. And from that position, he spent decades developing what might be the most audacious intellectual project of the late medieval world. Plethon's target was Aristotle, and he went after him hard. For centuries, Aristotle had dominated Greek and Western European thought. The Orthodox Church had essentially baptized Aristotelian philosophy, integrating it into Christian theology so thoroughly that challenging Aristotle felt like heresy. Plethon, perhaps unsurprisingly for someone who tried to revive the old Hellenic gods, thought this was a catastrophic mistake. Around 1438, when he was already in his late 70s, Plethon traveled to Italy as part of the Byzantine delegation to the Council of Florence. The council's official purpose was to reunite the Catholic and Orthodox churches, a desperate diplomatic move to secure economic and military aid. Plethon was there as a lay theologian, but what he actually did in Florence was far more interesting than the formal sessions. He gave lectures on Strabo, the ancient geographer, and he taught classes on Plato to Italian humanists who'd barely encountered Platonic thought in the original Greek. He wrote a treatise comparing Plato and Aristotle, arguing that Plato's conception of God as the active creator of everything was superior to Aristotle's version. He argued that Aristotle had reduced the divine to a mere force rather than an active being. Plethon accused Aristotle of degrading philosophy by wasting time on trivial investigations, when he should have been grappling with the structure of reality and the nature of the divine. Plethon was presenting a living philosophical lineage that the West had almost completely forgotten as the Greek world fell into oblivion over the previous centuries. His student Bessarion, who would later become a cardinal in the Roman Church, never forgot what he learned from Plethon in those years. The Florentine humanist Marsilio Ficino, who would eventually found the Platonic Academy in Florence, later called Plethon the second Plato. But Plethon's real project went far beyond academic philosophy, and back in Mistra he'd been working for years on a secret text that he shared only with his closest disciples. It was called the Nomoi, or Laws, and it laid out a complete alternative civilization that sought to recapture the fire of the ancient Greeks. The Nomoi proposed a new religion based on a reformed version of ancient Greek polytheism, filtered through Neoplatonic philosophy and elements drawn from Zoroastrian cosmology. Zeus sat at the top as the supreme eternal creator, with the other Olympian gods arranged in a strict hierarchy beneath him. The first-order gods who were direct emanations of Zeus, second-order gods below them, and so on down through the ranks. Plethon had systematized the Greek pantheon into something that looked more like a Neoplatonic metaphysical framework with familiar names attached. Taking notes from the Orthodox Christian faith he still officially claimed to be a part of, the religion he designed came with a full liturgical calendar. He prescribed daily prayers, hymns, ritual sacrifices, and seasonal festivals. He treated the ancient gods not as literal beings hurling thunderbolts, but as metaphysical principles that could be approached through contemplation and ritual. In essence, his idea wasn't solely a revival of the Hellenic gods, but of a completely new system where the old Greek gods were modernized. This system turned his imagining of ancient Greek religion into a formal, organized religion that could push back against Christianity and all other religious systems. But religion was only half of this system, and the nomoi also outlined a political utopia. Plethon proposed a government modeled on Plato's Republic, with a benevolent philosopher king at the top, and a radical program of land redistribution. Of course, there's the usual problem with philosopher kings, and that's the fact that they historically tend to be in severely short supply. But he wasn't too worried about that. Private land ownership would be replaced with communal holdings, and soldiers would be given plots to farm, ensuring both their loyalty and their self-sufficiency. He wanted a standing army trained in ancient Macedonian phalanx tactics and the rebuilding of the hexamillion wall across the Isthmus of Corinth to keep the Ottomans out. This latter idea, the rebuilding of the wall, was adopted, at least in part, though these efforts did little to keep the Turks out. While in Italy, Plethon's philosophical work was received with something close to reverence, his reputation in the Greek world was much more controversial. Plethon had a student named George Scholarios, who'd studied under him but gradually turned against everything he stood for. Scholarios became a fierce defender of Aristotle and of Orthodox Christian theology. He wrote a formal defense of Aristotle in response to Plethon's writings, and the two of them exchanged increasingly heated written arguments. Importantly, though, for reasons that will soon become apparent, it appears that Scholarios didn't know the full scale of Plethon's private beliefs. The real reckoning came after Plethon's death. He either died in Mistra around 1452, or possibly just before or just after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. We don't know for certain. It's really hard to emphasize what a chaotic time this was for the Greeks, since their civilization had, in essence, finally completely collapsed. With his passing, his manuscript of the Nomoi, which he'd kept carefully restricted during his lifetime, ended up in the hands of Princess Theodora, the wife of the despot of Morea. She passed it to Scholarios, who by then had become Patriarch Gennadios II of Constantinople, the foremost religious authority in the Greek Orthodox world. Scholarios read it and was horrified. Here was a book by one of the most respected philosophers in the Greek world that openly rejected Christianity. Plethon, during his lifetime, hadn't openly proposed replacing Christianity with pagan worship, instead only sharing the idea with his closest insiders. In 1460, Scholarios put the manuscript to the flame and attempted to destroy every copy of it. He called Plethon a deplorable apostate and argued that it was a Christian ruler's duty to destroy such material before it could poison the faithful. Ironically, he wrote a letter to another Christian leader with the chapter headings and the summary of its contents, which is one of the ways we know what Plethon argued for. A copy of a summary by one of Plethon's students also survived, and by cross-referencing the two independent sources, this is how we can know what he argued for. However, it's important to mention that the summary was made by Bessarion, who I had previously mentioned went on to become a Roman Catholic cardinal. In essence, both of these sources may have had a reason to portray Plethon as someone who had completely rejected Christianity. For Scholarios, he hated the man in life and wanted to tarnish his reputation as a Greek thinker to an audience that was entirely Greek Orthodox. For Bessarion, it's possible that he wanted to limit the influence of his teacher's views amongst Italian humanists by associating Plethon with openly pagan ideas. That said, if this was his plan, it didn't work out at all, and you're about to see why. But the story doesn't end with the burning and a couple summaries surviving, and as I mentioned, Plethon's ideas achieved something of a legendary status in Italy. 14 years after Plethon's death, in 1466, an Italian military commander named Sigismondo Malatesta was serving Venice in a campaign in Greece. Malatesta was the lord of Rimini, a condottiere and patron of the arts, who'd been deeply influenced by Plethon's ideas and by the wider circle of Italian humanists who revered him. Malatesta did something extraordinary. He had Plethon's remains exhumed from their grave in Mistra and transported them across the Adriatic to Rimini. There they were reinterred in the Tempio Malatestiano, where he continues to rest until this day. The stated reason was so that the great teacher could rest among free men, away from Ottoman-controlled territory. But the gesture was also a statement about intellectual legacy as well. In the East, Plethon's ideas had been condemned, and his life's work had been burned, while in the West, his bones were enshrined in a temple. Now there's one question that might be in your mind right now, and trust me, I had it too. To what extent did Plethon accumulate any legitimate followers to this new faith? Well, the truth is, we have absolutely no idea. But given that he imagined an entire hierarchy and church-like structure, it appears that the religion never left his inner circle. After all, had he preached this return to the old Greek gods publicly, he would have been removed from all positions of power at the very least. It's possible that he was the only person who actually followed this new faith, and that even his closest followers of his Platonic philosophies didn't buy into a return to Zeus. Plethon's project failed in the most literal sense, and as you are likely aware, the old Greek gods didn't come back during the late medieval period. The Byzantine Empire collapsed, and the Peloponnese ultimately fell to the Ottomans, with Greece not regaining any limited form of independence for nearly 400 years. In the end, in a bizarre irony, the man who wanted to bring back Zeus ended up buried in an Italian church. But the ideas he carried to Florence in 1438, the Platonic tradition he reintroduced to Western Europe, those didn't perish. His ideas became one of the foundations of the Renaissance, a tradition that would ultimately flourish while Greece was under a repressive regime. It's one of history's better ironies. The man who failed to save his own world accidentally helped build the next one, and despite this, almost no one knows his name today. On December 4th, 1977, in one of the poorest countries on earth, a man sat himself down on a 2-ton golden throne shaped like an eagle and placed a diamond-encrusted crown on his own head. His coronation robe weighed 32 pounds. It was embroidered with nearly 800,000 pearls and over 1 million crystal beads. The crown was topped with a 138-carat diamond, and the whole thing cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $25 million. Adjusted for inflation, that lands around $100 million today. That figure represented roughly 1/3 of the Central African Empire's entire annual budget, and nearly all of it was paid for by the people of France. His name was Jean Bedel Bokassa, and if you've never heard of him, that's probably because the story is so absurd it sounds made up. Every detail of his coronation is documented, verified, and somehow still hard to believe. Bokassa's early life was bleak, even by the standards of colonial Central Africa. He was born in 1921 in Bobangi, a village in the obscure French colony of Ubangi Shari. His father, a village chief, was beaten to death in 1927 by colonial administrators for refusing forced labor demands when Bokassa was just 6 years old. A week later, his mother, torn up by the event, decided she had enough of this world as well, leaving Bokassa an orphan. He was raised by Catholic missionaries, educated at mission schools, and eventually joined the French colonial army in 1939. What followed was a distinguished military career, and he served in Europe, Indochina, and Algeria, rose to the rank of captain, and received both the Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre. By any measure, he was a highly competent soldier with legitimate decorations, well respected by both the French and fellow colonial soldiers. But somewhere between the battlefields and the corridors of post-colonial African politics, Bokassa developed an obsession that would define and destroy his rule: Napoleon Bonaparte. The fixation wasn't subtle at all. He studied Napoleon's rise, his imagery, his coronation. He was completely consumed by the man, and believed that he was in essence the African Napoleon. He reportedly kept busts and portraits of the French emperor in his home, and spent lavishly on all manner of artifacts that were even loosely associated with the man. Presumably, though, he was less interested in how Napoleon's downfall came about, or perhaps he thought that he could do it all differently. When the time came to consolidate his own power, the template he reached for was European, imperial, and about 170 years out of date. On New Year's Day, 1966, Bokassa, then serving as Army Chief of Staff, overthrew President David Dacko in a largely nonviolent coup. The stated justification was Dacko's growing diplomatic ties with Communist China, indicating that he knew exactly how to justify this action to Western powers. France, which had extensive strategic interests in the region, was initially cautious about the new leader. Their concerns were allayed by November of that year, when Charles de Gaulle had made an official visit and came to believe Bokassa was an intelligent and powerful ruler. Over the following decade, Bokassa tightened his grip on the country, and as he did so, his Napoleon fantasy would slowly become closer to reality. He abolished the Constitution, dissolved the National Assembly, and declared himself president for life. Then, on December 4th, 1976, exactly 1 year before the coronation, he went further. He dissolved the Central African Republic unilaterally and proclaimed the Central African Empire, with himself as Emperor Bokassa I. The move had no popular demand and no practical rationale. It existed because Bokassa wanted it to exist, and of course, because Napoleon did it. France went along with it, and by the mid-1970s, President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had developed a personal relationship with Bokassa that went well beyond diplomacy. The two men were hunting companions, reportedly spending time together on annual trips in eastern Central Africa. The French president, both publicly and privately, referred to Bokassa as a friend, and perhaps more surprisingly, as a family member. The relationship would later become one of the more damaging political scandals in modern French history, but in 1977, the friendship was still a functioning arrangement. The coronation itself was modeled on Napoleon's 1804 ceremony down to specific details. The Golden Eagle throne was crafted by 30 French artisans in Normandy at a cost of $2.5 million. The crown was made by a prestigious Parisian jeweler, and Bokassa's robe was designed by a 200-year-old business that had an association with Napoleon. 8 white horses were imported from Belgium, to pull a restored 19th century carriage through the streets of Bangui, the capital. Unfortunately, two of the horses died before the event due to climate issues, so Bokassa and his wife Catherine finished the procession in a limousine instead. That symbolism should have been a warning for what would come next, but it wasn't. The ceremony took place at a stadium in Bangui that was named after Emperor Bokassa himself. It was staggeringly hot, over 35 degrees Celsius, with roughly 90% humidity. Foreign dignitaries in formal wear reportedly suffered badly, but the bigger problem for Bokassa wasn't the heat. Nearly every monarch and significant world leader invited had declined to attend the event. Emperor Hirohito of Japan, the Shah of Iran, Pope Paul VI, all sent their regrets that they wouldn't be able to make it. Some believed that the plan had been to have the Pope crown Emperor Bokassa, or at least to have Bokassa take the crown from the Pope and then crown himself and his empress. The reason this speculation is so significant is because this was exactly what Napoleon himself did more than a century and a half prior. Even Bokassa's fellow African strongmen found excuses to stay home. Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, Omar Bongo of Gabon, Idi Amin of Uganda, none of them showed. The highest-ranking foreign royal present was reportedly the Prince of Liechtenstein, a fact that Bokassa reportedly considered somewhat humiliating to His Imperial Majesty. France sent Robert Galley, its Minister of Cooperation, rather than any senior figure, again to the disappointment of the new African emperor. The streets of Bangui were lined with onlookers who, by contemporary accounts, showed little obvious enthusiasm. The international press was merciless, and coverage focused on the contrast between the ceremony's opulence and the country's poverty. Bokassa's coronation couldn't have happened without French money and French complicity. France funded the ceremony primarily through development assistance, effectively channeling an entire year's worth of foreign aid to the Central African Republic into a single day. France even loaned 17 aircraft and assigned personnel to support the orchestra. The strategic logic centered on maintaining French influence in a region it considered part of its sphere of control. Bokassa was both increasingly erratic and increasingly brutal, but he was cooperative on matters France cared about. The coronation was the price of keeping him in the fold, and whether anyone in Paris genuinely believed this was sustainable is another question entirely. The coronation was the high water mark of Bokassa's reign, and everything after it moved in one direction. In January 1979, Bokassa ordered all students, from elementary school through university, to purchase and wear uniforms manufactured by a company owned by one of his wives. When students protested, the regime responded with mass arrests of the students, including ones who were in elementary school. On April 19, 1979, approximately 100 students were beaten to death by guards while imprisoned. Subsequent investigations alleged that Bokassa personally participated in the violence, though he denied it for the rest of his life. In fact, he denied ordering it at all, simply stating that it was an action taken by people who were acting outside the law. The massacre prompted international condemnation and the withdrawal of foreign aid. France, now politically exposed by its long relationship with Bokassa, moved to cut ties. On September 20th, 1979, while Bokassa was in Libya meeting with Muammar Gaddafi, French special forces executed Operation Barracuda. French paratroopers landed in Bangui with helicopters and transport aircraft. There was no significant resistance, and it was over within hours. David Dacko, the same man Bokassa had overthrown 13 years earlier, was restored to power. Unsurprisingly, the Central African Empire ceased to exist, and the Central African Republic was restored. Barely a month later, a French newspaper revealed that Bokassa had given diamonds to Giscard d'Estaing, reportedly worth around 1 million francs. Giscard issued a denial, describing the gifts as small stones given between friends. Bokassa, for his part, contradicted him, claiming he'd given diamonds of 10 to 20 carats on multiple occasions, and that Giscard's extended family had received even more. The scandal dogged the French president through the 1981 presidential election, which he lost to François Mitterrand. Bokassa spent 4 years in exile in the Ivory Coast, and then moved to France, but, as it turned out, he longed for his homeland. In 1986, he voluntarily returned to the Central African Republic, where he was immediately arrested and charged with a variety of serious offenses. In the end, he was only convicted of treason, though he was later pardoned in 1993 before passing away, almost completely forgotten on November 3, 1996. The coronation remains the thing people remember, if they remember Emperor Bokassa at all. Hey everyone, just taking a moment to drop a quick reminder to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell if you haven't done so already. Also, don't forget that you can drop a recommendation for a history topic you'd like to see me cover in the comments as well. If you're standing at Ashington in southeast Essex right now, you're looking at gently rolling farmland, a quiet parish church, and not much else. And yet, most historians believe this is where, on October 18th, 1016, one of the most consequential battles in English history took place. This was a battle that ended Anglo-Saxon resistance to Danish conquest and handed England to a foreign king. The Battle of Assendon doesn't get the attention of Hastings, which happened almost exactly 50 years later. But in many ways, it was the more decisive engagement, given how it would permanently weaken the kingdom. Assendon broke the back of an English kingdom that had been fighting for its survival, wiped out a generation of military leadership, and forced a political settlement that would reshape England. England in the early 11th century was a very wealthy kingdom in a deep crisis. King Ethelred, who history remembers as the Unready, had been struggling against Danish raids and invasions for most of his reign. By 1013, those raids had escalated into full-scale conquest, led by Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. He devastated southern and midland England systematically, and by Christmas Day, 1013, the English nobility had given up on Ethelred entirely and acknowledged Sweyn as their king. Sweyn's triumph was short-lived. He died on the 3rd of February 1014, having ruled England for barely 5 weeks. The cause of his death is uncertain, but the political consequences were immediate. His death created a power vacuum, and Ethelred returned from exile with military force, briefly reasserting control and driving Sweyn's son Canute out of the country. Ethelred's forces marched to Lindsey and destroyed much of Canute's remaining support base. But Ethelred himself was a spent force, and when he passed away in April 1016, the fight passed to his son Edmund, who would earn the nickname Ironside for good reason. Edmund was everything his father wasn't. He was energetic, aggressive, and willing to lead from the front. When Canute returned to England in September 1015 with a formidable invasion force, Edmund heroically rallied the resistance. The year that followed was one of the most intense periods of sustained military campaigning England had ever seen. Edmund and Canute fought at least 5 major engagements before Assendon, with Edmund winning some and losing others, neither side able to land a knockout blow. Edmund lifted the siege of London, fought Canute to a standstill at Brentford, and chased the Danish army across half of southern England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the grinding nature of this campaign in exhausting detail. Armies marched and countermarched across southern England, ravaging the countryside as they went. Canute's forces raided through Dorset, Wiltshire, and Somerset, all while Edmund pursued, engaged, withdrew, and regrouped. It was attritional warfare at a scale England hadn't experienced since the days of Alfred the Great, 2 centuries earlier. By October 1016, both sides were battered, and Edmund had gathered what forces he could and pursued Canute's army into Essex. The two forces converged near a place the chroniclers called Assendin, a place that was apparently so renowned in its time that no one actually bothered to say where it was. The precise mechanics of what happened on October 18th, 1016, are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Between the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, John of Worcester's Chronicle, and Henry of Huntingdon's Historia Anglorum, we can piece together the broad strokes. The English army reportedly formed up on higher ground, arranged in a battle line 4 ranks deep. Edmund, according to Henry of Huntingdon, abandoned his position between the royal standards and charged into the Danish front ranks himself. It was a display of personal courage that bordered on recklessness, and it speaks to the desperate nature of the fight. And then Edric Strona, one of the most powerful and duplicitous figures in all of English history, made his move. He'd actually switched sides between Edmund and Canute multiple times already. At Assendin, he was nominally fighting for Edmund since the young king couldn't afford not to take on such a powerful apparent ally, despite previous betrayals. But at the critical moment, Edric withdrew his forces from the battle, taking his large contingent of well-trained warriors with him. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is blunt about it. Edric started the flight, and in doing so betrayed his king and all the people of England. Whether Edric had struck a deal with Canute beforehand, or simply read the battlefield and decided to back the winning side, historians have debated for 1,000 years. What isn't debated is the effect. Edric's withdrawal tore a hole in the English line and turned an evenly matched battle into a rout. Henry of Huntingdon later wrote that there was never greater treachery in England than what happened at Assendin. Notably, the casualty list would, in essence, become a roll call of the entire upper echelon of the Anglo-Saxon ruling class. With his army shattered and his support base decimated, Edmund had little choice but to negotiate. He and Canute met on a small island called Alney, near Deerhurst in Gloucestershire, on the River Severn. The terms they agreed upon sounded reasonable enough on paper, but they carried a hidden threat, since each agreed to make the other man the successor to the territories. Edmund would keep Wessex and London, and Canute would take everything north of the Thames, including all the old Danelaw territories. Edmund, for his part, died just 6 weeks after the treaty, of quote-unquote unknown causes, having reigned for only 222 days. Canute inherited the entire kingdom, and he was crowned King of all England before the year was out. In 1020, Canute returned to the site of the battle and dedicated a church in memory of all those who'd fallen there, regardless of what side they'd been on. Some scholars have identified this as the Church of St. Andrew at Ashington, but the truth is, no one knows for certain. The Ashington location has a serious archaeological problem for a battle of this supposed size and scope. There's simply absolutely no remnants to indicate a battle ever took place there. The location question itself tells you something about how poorly this battle has been remembered. Despite being one of the most fateful battles in English history, a battle that changed the course of the history of the world, we only have an educated guess as to where it took place. Most modern scholars lean towards Ashington, but the debate continues, and unless new archaeological evidence comes to light, it probably always will.